In a late-night Amtrak train cutting through Nevada's frozen desert, a silver-haired woman quietly reading was about to become the target of a violent ex-con's attention. What began as an ordinary commute turned deadly when Dante Deek Rowles, fresh from 3 years in prison, boarded the nearly empty car searching for dominance and a victim. Elena Seagal wasn't your typical passenger. For over 2 decades, she had been a federal marshal specializing in hostage negotiations and criminal psychology, known for her ability to defuse the most dangerous confrontations through psychological warfare rather than physical force. When Deek slapped Elena across the face, he had no idea he was attacking the wife of martial arts legend Steven Seagal, or that her unnatural calm was the first signal of a calculated psychological trap. Elena's clinical questioning and refusal to show fear would trigger a confrontation that would be live-streamed to thousands and become a viral sensation. What began as random intimidation would become a masterclass in how preparation and composure could dismantle violence. The passengers on that train, and the millions who would watch the viral footage, would never see strength and vulnerability the same way again after the night one man made the fatal mistake of underestimating the quiet power of Steven Seagal's wife. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The last train of the night cut through Nevada's frozen desert. Like a blade through black silk, its headlight carving a solitary path between starless sky and endless wasteland. Inside car 7, fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby over scattered passengers who had claimed their territories with the practiced efficiency of late-night travelers. Elena Seagal sat 3 rows from the front, her silver-streaked hair catching the overhead light as she turned another page on her e-reader. 23 years of marriage to Steven Seagal had taught her to read situations before reading words, and tonight's commute felt different. Not dangerous yet, just attentive. Her peripheral vision cataloged the car's contents without lifting her eyes. Emergency call buttons positioned every 6 seats, 3 exit points, security camera mounted above the rear door, and 7 other passengers maintaining the sacred silence of the 11:47 p.m. westbound. Near the front, Carter and Gwen Decker huddled together like bookends, their matching gray hair and synchronized movements speaking to 5 decades of shared everything. Carter whispered something that made Gwen smile, her weathered hand squeezing his with the automatic comfort of couples who'd learned to find humor in uncertainty. A college student slumped against the window 4 seats behind Elena, earbuds creating his private sanctuary, textbooks scattered across the empty seat beside him like fallen dominoes. His breath fogged the glass in steady intervals, asleep, or pretending to be. 16-year-old Tasha Morales sat across the aisle, phone glowing as she scrolled through social media with the restless energy of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Her return trip from visiting her father always left her edgy, caught between 2 lives that never quite aligned. She'd promised her mother she'd stay alert on late trains, and something about tonight's quiet felt too deliberate. At the very back of the car, almost invisible in the shadow between overhead lights, sat a figure Tasha had glimpsed only briefly when boarding. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap pulled low. He hadn't moved since she'd noticed him, hadn't checked his phone or shifted position. Just watching, waiting. Elena sensed him too, though she'd never turned to look directly. Former federal marshals developed a sixth sense about watchers, and this one felt familiar. Protective. She allowed herself the smallest smile and returned to her book. The train's rhythm changed as it began to slow, brakes engaging with a soft mechanical sigh. Victor Penrose's voice crackled over the intercom, professional despite the late hour. Next stop, Fernley Station. Passengers boarding, please have your tickets ready. Elena's attention sharpened. Fernley was barely a stop, more of a depot where freight trains sometimes picked up supplies. Passenger service called there maybe twice a week, and never this late. She marked her page and waited. The train shuddered to a complete stop. Through the windows, Elena could see nothing but darkness punctuated by a single sodium light that cast everything in sickly yellow. No platform, no station building, just gravel and the endless desert beyond. The door between cars hissed open. Dante Deek, Rowles stepped through like he owned the space, his entrance deliberate and theatrical. 6'2" with the kind of muscle that spoke more to prison workouts than gym memberships. He surveyed car 7 with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating a hunting ground. Tribal tattoos crawled up his neck like black vines, and his tight black t-shirt stretched across shoulders that had learned their shape from violence. His eyes swept the car methodically, cataloging weakness and opportunity. The old couple, too frail, too boring. The college kid, possible, but asleep targets weren't fun. The teenager with the phone, maybe, but kids were unpredictable, might have parents tracking them. Then his gaze settled on Elena. Still reading, still calm, still completely unaware of his presence, apparently. Deek smiled. Perfect, he claimed. A seat 3 rows behind her with unnecessary force, dropping his worn duffel bag with a deliberate thud that echoed through the quiet car. Carter Decker glanced back nervously, but Gwen squeezed his hand again, their silent language saying not our fight, not yet. The college student's breathing pattern changed slightly, still pretending sleep, but listening now. Tasha Morales felt. Her pulse quickened. Something about the new passenger's energy made her thumb hover over her phone screen. Muscle memory from countless true crime podcasts whispering warnings. She opened her livestream app, angling the camera subtly. 3 followers. Online, her friends from school, probably doing homework. This might be nothing, she whispered into the phone, barely audible, but something feels off. Deek stretched, rolling his shoulders and cracking his neck with sounds that seemed amplified in the quiet car. He was performing now, establishing presence, claiming psychological territory. Every movement said the same thing. I'm here now. Things are different. Elena turned another page. The train lurched back into motion, wheels finding their rhythm against steel rails. Through the windows, Nevada's emptiness resumed its passage, mile after mile of nothing, no witnesses, no help, no interference. Victor's voice returned, ladies and gentlemen, we're now approaching our final stretch into Reno. Please remain seated until we reach the station. Thank you for choosing Amtrak. But Victor's tone carried something else, a subtle emphasis on remain seated that trained ears might recognize as a suggestion. Elena's fingers paused on her e-reader. She'd heard that tone before, in hostage negotiations and tactical briefings. It was the voice of someone who saw trouble coming and was trying to prevent it without escalating it. At the back of the car, the shadowy figure shifted almost imperceptibly. Still watching, still waiting. Deek cracked his knuckles, the sound, sharp as gunshots in the quiet space. The hunt was about to begin. Deek let the silence stretch for exactly 30 seconds, long enough to ensure everyone had registered his presence, short enough to maintain the tension he'd created. Then he stood, using the train's natural sway as an excuse to stumble slightly, testing the car's reaction. The college student pressed deeper into his window seat, earbuds pushed further in despite no music playing. Carter Decker's weathered hand found his wife's and squeezed. Tasha's livestream viewer count jumped to 7. Word was spreading among her friends that something was happening. Quiet car tonight, Deek announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying the forced casualness of someone auditioning. For an audience, real quiet. Elena didn't look up. The slight burned more than he'd expected. In Folsom, even the lifers acknowledged new arrivals. Respect or fear didn't matter which, but acknowledgement was currency. This silver-haired woman was treating him like furniture. Deek moved to the college kid first, sliding into the seat across the aisle with deliberate invasion of space. Hey, college boy, what's in the bag? The student mumbled something non-committal, clutching his backpack tighter. Can't hear you. Deek pushed, leaning closer. They teach you to speak up in college, or just how to waste daddy's money. Just textbooks. The kid finally managed, voice tight with the strain of avoiding confrontation. Textbooks. Deek laughed, a sound without humor. What they teaching you that you couldn't learn on the streets? Life skills. How to handle yourself when someone gets in your face. The student said nothing, and Deek's attention wandered. Too easy. No sport in terrorizing someone who'd already given up. Victor Penrose's voice crackled over the intercom again. Passengers, please remember to keep personal belongings secure and respect your fellow travelers. We'll be arriving in Reno in approximately 45 minutes. The announcement was standard protocol, but Elena caught the subtle emphasis on respect your fellow travelers. Victor was watching, had seen enough to start issuing gentle warnings. She filed the information away. Backup was aware, which meant she had options if the situation escalated beyond her control. Deek heard it too, but interpreted it differently. Authority trying to box him in, tell him how to behave. The familiar resentment flared. Parole officers, prison guards, social workers, all of them thinking they knew better, thinking they could control him with words. He turned his attention to the elderly couple. "You two been married long?" he asked Carter and Gwen, his voice carrying false friendliness that fooled no one. 53 years, Carter replied carefully, protective arm around his wife. 53 years. Damn. Deek shook his head in mock amazement. That's a long time to be stuck with the same person. Never get tired of looking at the same face. Every morning? Gwen Decker spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite her husband's tension. Never tired, young man. Sometimes surprised, always grateful. Something in her calm dignity reminded Deek of the prison chaplain who'd tried to counsel him, that same unshakable peace that made him feel small and angry. He moved on. Finally, inevitably, his focus settled on Elena. She sat with the kind of stillness that spoke to discipline rather than relaxation, back straight but not rigid, shoulders level, breathing controlled. Her e-reader cast a soft glow on her face, highlighting the silver threads in her hair and the laugh lines around her eyes. She looked like someone's grandmother, maybe a retired teacher or librarian. Perfect victim material. "What's so interesting in that book, lady?" he called out, loud enough for the entire car to hear. Elena's eyes didn't lift from the screen. The non-response hit Deek like a physical slap. Everyone else had reacted. Fear, nervousness, discomfort. This woman was treating him like he didn't exist. "I asked you a question," he said, standing up and taking a step closer to her seat. "Rude not to answer when someone's talking to you." Tasha angled her phone slightly, capturing the growing confrontation. Her viewer count had jumped to 23, and comments were starting to roll in. "Girl, get out of there. Call someone. This looks bad." Elena finally looked up, her gaze meeting Deek's with the same calm attention she might give a mildly interesting cloud formation. No fear, no anger, no emotion at all. Just assessment. "Just a book," she said, her voice carrying the neutral tone of someone stating an obvious fact. "Nothing that would interest you." The dismissal was surgical in its precision. Not condescending, not frightened, just a simple statement of reality that somehow made Deek feel smaller than any insult could have. "How do you know what interests me?" he demanded, dropping into the seat across from her without invitation. "Maybe I'm a big reader. Maybe I've read whatever boring shit you're into." Elena marked her page and closed the e-reader, giving him her full attention for the first time. Her eyes were gray-green, the color of storm clouds, and they studied him with the dispassionate focus of a scientist examining a specimen. "Maybe," she agreed mildly. At the back of the car, the shadow shifted. Still seated, still watching. But something had changed in the quality of attention. The watcher was no longer passive. Deek felt it, that prickle of awareness that came from being observed by someone dangerous. But when he glanced back, he saw only darkness and empty seats. "So what is it?" he pressed, turning back to Elena. "Romance novel? Self-help? Something about finding yourself through yoga and organic fucking vegetables?" "Criminal psychology," Elena said simply. The words hung in the air like smoke. Deek's confidence flickered for just a moment before his ego rushed to fill the gap. "Criminal psychology," he repeated, forcing a laugh. "You studying criminals, lady? Trying to figure out what makes us tick?" Elena tilted her head slightly, considering the question with genuine thoughtfulness. "I used to profile them for a living," she said. "Now I just read for pleasure." The admission should have been threatening, should have put Deek on guard. Instead, it felt like a challenge. A gauntlet thrown down by someone who thought she understood him, thought she could predict his next move. He leaned forward, invading her personal space, letting his size and presence fill her field of vision. "Yeah? And what's your professional opinion, Doc? What kind of criminal am I?" Elena's expression didn't change, but something shifted in. Her posture, a subtle straightening, a microscopic adjustment that somehow made her seem larger despite not moving. "The kind that mistakes silence for weakness," she said quietly. The train swayed through a long curve, lights from distant towns, flickering through the windows like fallen stars. In the reflection, Elena could see Steven rising from his seat at the back of the car, moving with the fluid grace that had made him a legend. But not yet. Not until she needed him. Deek was still talking, still posturing, still convinced he was in control. He had no idea that every word, every gesture, every tell was being cataloged and analyzed by someone who'd spent 20 years reading dangerous men like him. The trap was being set, one calm response at a time. Deek's world had always been binary, predator or prey, strong or weak, winner or victim. In his experience, silence meant submission, and composure was just fear wearing a mask. This woman's unflappable calm could only mean one thing. She was paralyzed with terror, frozen like a rabbit in headlights. Time to push harder. You know what I think, he said, leaning back in his seat with the lazy confidence of a cat that had cornered a mouse. I think you're full of shit. Criminal psychology. He snorted. Probably never seen a real criminal in your life. Elena regarded him with the same steady attention, as if he were a particularly interesting case study. Which, in a way, he was. What's your name? Deek demanded, his voice taking on an edge. Come on, we're having a conversation here. Be polite. Elena. Elena. He rolled the name around his mouth like he was tasting it. Pretty name. Spanish? No. The monosyllabic response irritated him further. This wasn't how intimidation worked. Victims were supposed to babble, to over-explain, to try, to humanize themselves in hopes of finding mercy. Elena was giving him nothing to work with. Tasha's live stream had grown to 47 viewers, her whispered commentary drawing friends and strangers alike into the unfolding drama. The chat was exploding with concern and advice. Someone call 911. Get the conductor. She's so calm it's scary. Why isn't she running? Victor Penrose had noticed the activity on his security monitor. 23 years of conducting late night. Rowles had taught him to read body language through grainy camera feeds, and what he was seeing made his hand drift toward the emergency communication button. Not yet. No physical contact, no overt threats, but the situation was deteriorating. What's in the bag, Elena? Deek reached toward her purse, fingers splayed in casual threat. For the first time, Elena moved, not away from him, but subtly, adjusting her position so that his reaching hand would have to cross her body to make contact. It was a small shift, barely noticeable, but it changed the geometry of the interaction. Now any grab would look like assault to the cameras, would justify immediate intervention. Personal items, she said simply. Personal items. Deek's frustration was building, his need for dominance clashing against her immovable calm. You're not very chatty, are you, Elena? Most people, when someone's trying to have a friendly conversation, they participate. They show some manners. Elena's eyebrows lifted slightly, the first hint of expression she'd shown. Is that what you think you're doing? Having a friendly conversation? The question was delivered without sarcasm or accusation, just genuine curiosity. But it hit Deek like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the gap between his self-perception and reality. Yeah, I'm being friendly, he snarled, his composure cracking. More friendly than you deserve, probably. Sitting there like you're better than everyone else, reading your fancy books, pretending you don't see what's right in front of you. And what's right in front of me? Elena asked. At the back of the car, Steven Seagal remained perfectly still, but his attention had focused to laser intensity. He could read his wife's micro-expressions after 2 decades of marriage, could see the subtle shift in her breathing that meant she was moving from assessment to action. Still passive, still gathering information, but no longer purely defensive. Deek stood up abruptly, using his height to loom over Elena's seat. What's in front of you is someone who's been locked up for 3 years, who's learned what real violence looks like, who doesn't have patience for stuck-up bitches who think they're too good to show basic human courtesy. Elena absorbed the information, recent release, violent history, escalating aggression, and filed it alongside her earlier observations. Insecure, craving validation, using intimidation to mask deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. Textbook case. 3 years. She mused aloud. That's not insignificant. What were you in for? The question caught Deek off guard. Victims weren't supposed to interview their attackers, weren't supposed to show clinical interest in criminal histories. Assault, he said, puffing his chest. Slightly. Put a guy in the hospital who thought he could talk down to me. Aggravated or simple? What? The assault charge. Aggravated or simple? There's a significant difference in sentencing guidelines. Deek stared at her, his brain struggling to process why someone he was trying to intimidate was asking follow-up questions about legal classifications. Does it matter? He finally managed. It might, Elena said thoughtfully. Simple assault. Suggests impulse control issues, possibly substance-related. Aggravated usually indicates premeditation, weapon usage, or significant injury to the victim. Different psychological profiles entirely. Carter Decker whispered to his wife, "She's not afraid of him." Gwen squeezed his hand in response, her own eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. She's studying him. Tasha's viewer count had topped 100, her phone getting hot from the processing demands of the livestream. Comments were flying faster than she could read. "She's a psychologist or something. This is the calmest person I've ever seen. She's either crazy brave or crazy crazy. Someone get help." Deek's face flushed red. The conversation had somehow gotten away from him, turned from intimidation into interrogation. He was supposed to be the one asking questions, demanding answers, controlling the flow of information. "Why the fuck does that matter?" he exploded, loud enough to make the college student flinch. "I'm not your patient, lady. I'm not here for fucking therapy." Elena nodded as if he'd made a reasonable point. "You're right. You're not my patient. And I'm not offering therapy." "Good. Because I've had enough shrinks trying to get inside my head, telling me what my problems are. Acting like they understand. I understand perfectly," Elena interrupted, her voice still calm, but carrying a new undertone of authority. "You're angry, frustrated, looking for control because you feel powerless. You've been institutionalized. For 3 years, stripped of autonomy, and now you're out, but discovering that the world hasn't waited for you. So you're trying to recreate the power dynamics you learned inside, dominate or be dominated, intimidate or be intimidated." Deek's mouth worked soundlessly, his prepared responses crumbling under the surgical precision of her analysis. "The problem," Elena continued, "is that you've chosen the wrong target." Something in her tone, not threatening, just factual, made Deek's skin crawl. For the first time since boarding the train, he felt a flicker of uncertainty. "What's that supposed to mean?" Elena smiled then, a small expression that somehow made her seem more dangerous than any snarl or glare could have. "It means," she said quietly, "that you've made a mistake." At the back of the car, Steven Seagal's hand moved to rest on the arm of his seat, ready to rise. His wife was transitioning from defensive to offensive, which meant the situation was about to change dramatically. Deek felt it too, that shift in the air that preceded violence. But he misread it, interpreted it as his own building rage rather than the calm preparation of someone who'd faced down armed killers and walked away. His hand rose without conscious thought, pulled back, and slapped Elena across the face. The sound cracked through the car like a gunshot. Time fractured. Elena's head turned with the force of the blow, silver hair catching the fluorescent light. The red mark bloomed across her cheek like a flower opening. But she didn't cry out, didn't gasp, didn't even bring her hand to her face. Instead, she turned back to look at Deek with the same calm assessment as before, except now something fundamental had changed in her eyes. The clinical detachment was still there, but underneath it burned something far more dangerous. "You just made your last mistake," she said quietly. Tasha's phone nearly slipped from her trembling hands. Her live stream had exploded, viewers climbing past 500, comments flooding in faster than her connection could handle. But her whispered narration had stopped. She was frozen, watching something she'd never seen before, violence meeting absolute fearlessness. The college student's eyes were wide above his fake sleeping facade. Carter Decker's arm tightened protectively around his wife, but neither of them looked away. Even they could sense that what was happening transcended ordinary confrontation. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Deek stood over Elena, his hand still raised, confusion replacing the momentary satisfaction he'd felt. The slap should have broken her composure, should have reduced her to tears or pleading or at least acknowledgement of his power. Instead, she was looking at him like he'd just confirmed a hypothesis. "Feel better?" Elena asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity. "What?" Deek's hand dropped, the question catching him off guard. "The violence. Does it make you feel more in control?" Victor Penrose had seen the assault on his security monitor. His finger hovered over the emergency alert button, but something made him pause. The victim wasn't behaving like a victim. She was sitting straighter now, more alert, but not afraid. If anything, she seemed expectant. "Lady, you are seriously fucked in the head," Deek said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Normal people don't react like this." "No," Elena agreed. "They don't." At the back of the car, a shadow began to move. Steven Seagal rose from his seat with liquid grace, his movement so smooth it seemed to defy the train's sway. He was tall, taller than Deek had realized when glimpsing him earlier, and moved with the fluid economy of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the marriage of power and control. But he didn't rush forward. He simply stood, hands at his sides, and began walking down the aisle with measured steps. Deek sensed the movement before he saw it, that primitive awareness that predators develop when they've become prey. He spun around, expecting another passenger coming to help, maybe the conductor responding to the commotion. What he saw made his blood freeze. The man walking toward him was no ordinary passenger. Even in the dim light, even partially shadowed by the overhead fixtures, there was no mistaking that face, that build, that unmistakable presence that had dominated action movies for decades. "Holy shit," Deek breathed. He's my husband," Elena said from behind him. Steven Seagal continued his approach, each step deliberate and unhurried. He wasn't rushing to rescue anyone. There was no urgency in his movement, no panic or anger. Just the inevitable advance of someone who'd made a decision. Tasha's livestream was going insane. Her viewer count had topped 3,000, and comments were exploding. That's Steven Seagal? Holy shit, she's his wife, this guy is so fucked. I can't believe this is real." Deek's mouth worked soundlessly, his brain struggling to process what was happening. The quiet woman he'd been terrorizing wasn't just some random passenger. She was married to one of the most famous martial artists in the world. "Look, man," he started, backing away from Elena's seat, hands raised in what he hoped looked like surrender. "I didn't know. She didn't say anything about." Steven reached the row where Deek stood and stopped, close enough that his presence filled the space, but far enough to give the ex-con room to make better choices. "She shouldn't have to," Steven said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people listen. "She's a person. That should be enough." Up close, Deek could see the details that made Steven Seagal a legend, the way he held himself, the complete absence of fear or uncertainty, the sense that violence was always an option but never the preferred one. This wasn't some washed-up actor trading on past glory. This was a man who'd spent his life studying conflict and had achieved something rarer than victory, the ability to end fights without throwing a punch. "I wasn't going to hurt her," Deek lied, his voice cracking. "I was just talking." Elena spoke from her seat, never turning around. "He slapped me." Steven's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him. Deek could feel it, the transition from contained power to active threat. "I saw," Steven said simply. Those two words carried more menace than any lengthy threat could have. Deek realized with growing horror that Steven had been watching the entire time, had seen every escalation, every crossed line, every choice that had led to this moment. "Look, I'll go back to my seat," Deek stammered. "No problem. We're all good here." "Are we?" Steven asked Elena, still not taking his eyes off Deek. Elena finally stood, moving with the fluid grace of someone whose body had been trained for violence, but whose mind preferred other solutions. She was smaller than Deek, smaller than her husband, but somehow she seemed to fill more space than either of them. "That depends," she said, "on whether he's learned anything." Tasha's whispered commentary resumed, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "I don't think you guys understand. She's been in control this whole time. She was never the victim. She was setting a trap." The realization hit Deek like a physical blow. The calm, the questions, the clinical detachment. Elena hadn't been frozen with fear. She'd been gathering intelligence, profiling him, waiting for him to cross the line that would justify her husband's intervention. He'd been played. Carter Decker leaned over to his wife. 53 years of marriage," he whispered, "and I still learn something new about partnership every day." Gwen smiled despite the tension. They don't even need to speak to communicate. But Deek was beyond learning, beyond rational thought. The humiliation of being outmaneuvered, the shame of falling for such an obvious setup, the terror of facing Steven Seagal, it all combined into a toxic cocktail that overwhelmed what little self-control he'd maintained. His hand moved to his jacket pocket, fingers closing around the handle of a folding knife. "Nobody makes a fool out of me," he snarled, the blade clicking open. "Movie star or not, I'll cut you both." The train car went dead silent except for the mechanical rhythm of wheels on tracks. Even the overhead lights seemed to dim, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Steven Seagal looked at the knife in Deek's shaking hand and smiled, not with malice or anticipation, but with the sad recognition of inevitability. "You sure that's how you want this to go?" he asked gently. Elena stepped slightly to the side, giving her husband room to work while staying close enough to help if needed. 23 years of marriage had taught them to move as one unit when violence became unavoidable. Tasha's livestream was approaching 10,000 viewers, the comments section a blur of excitement and terror. But her attention had focused down to the knife in Deek's hand and the absolute stillness of the two people facing him. "This is it," she whispered into her phone. "This is really happening." The next few seconds would determine whether this story ended with wisdom or bloodshed. Whether Deek would learn from his mistakes or become another cautionary tale about the dangers of mistaking calm for weakness. The train swayed through another curve, the lights of distant civilization flickering through the windows like stars. And in car 7, 3 people stood in perfect balance on the knife's edge between violence and restraint, waiting to see which way gravity would pull them. The folding knife trembled in Deek's grip, its blade catching the fluorescent light, like a fragment of captured lightning. 3 inches of steel, not much, but enough to change everything. Enough to transform this from a lesson in humility into something that would haunt the survivors forever. Steven Seagal studied the weapon with the detached interest of a craftsman evaluating a tool. Not fear, not anger, just professional assessment of threat vectors and response options. The blade was cheap, probably picked up at a truck stop, held by someone whose desperation had finally overwhelmed his survival instincts. "Put it down," Steven said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Walk away. This doesn't have to end badly for you." Deek laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "For me? You think I'm worried about some washed-up movie star? I've taken down bigger guys than you in prison, old man. You're just another pretty face who learned some dance moves for the cameras." Elena remained perfectly still, but her eyes tracked every micro-movement of Deek's body language. The knife hand was shaking, adrenaline, not fear. His weight was shifting forward onto his toes, classic pre-attack positioning. But his breathing was ragged, uncontrolled. He was operating on panic now, not strategy. "He's going to lunge," she said calmly, as if commenting on the weather. Tasha's live stream exploded with viewers, 15,000, and climbing exponentially as words spread across social media. The comments section had become incomprehensible, a blur of excitement, terror, and disbelief. "Someone call 911. This is insane. She just told him what he's going to do." Steven Seagal bowed to end this fool. Victor Penrose had abandoned subtlety, his finger hovering over the emergency button while he radioed ahead to Reno Station. "We have a weapons situation in car 7. Requesting immediate police response upon arrival. Repeat, weapons situation with multiple passengers at risk." But even as he spoke into his radio, Victor found himself mesmerized by what he was witnessing. On his security monitor, the woman, Elena, wasn't cowering or pleading. She was standing beside her husband like they were partners in some deadly dance they'd performed 1,000 times before. "You think you know what I'm gonna do?" Deek snarled at Elena, his grip tightening on the knife. "You think your shrink bullshit works on everyone?" "I think," Elena said with clinical precision, "that you're operating from a limbic response now. Fight or flight has engaged, cortisol is flooding your system, and your fine motor control is compromised. You're going to telegraph your attack. By at least half a second." Deek's face twisted with rage. "Let's see how smart you are when I cut that pretty face." He lunged. Elena had called it perfectly. Deek's weight shifted, his shoulder dropped, his knife hand drew back in a wide, clumsy arc that would have been devastating against an untrained opponent but was laughably slow against someone who'd spent decades studying violence. Steven moved. Not quickly, There was no rushed urgency, no desperate scramble. He simply flowed, his body shifting like water around Deek's attack. His left hand rose to intercept the knife arm, while his right found Deek's wrist, and suddenly the ex-con was airborne, his body following the arc of Steven's movement until he crashed into the empty seats across the aisle. The knife clattered across the floor, spinning under the seats like a broken promise. Deek lay stunned, his brain struggling to process what had happened. One moment he'd been attacking, dominant, in control. The next he was on his back, staring at the ceiling, his entire body aching from an impact he hadn't seen coming. Jesus Christ, the college student whispered, finally abandoning his pretense of sleep. He didn't even punch him. Tasha's hands were shaking so hard, she could barely hold her phone steady. "Did you guys see that?" she whispered into the live stream. He just moved, like the guy was attacking in slow motion. 20,000 viewers and climbing. The chat was moving too fast to read, but the tone was universal amazement. This wasn't movie choreography or staged combat. This was the real thing, captured live and unfiltered. Carter Decker turned to his wife with wonder in his eyes. "In 53 years, I've never seen anything like that." Gwen squeezed his hand, her own eyes bright with excitement. "Reminded me of watching you fix that old clock. Everything in its proper place, everything at the right moment." Elena moved to where Deek lay groaning, her medical training taking precedence over everything else. She checked his pupils, felt for obvious fractures, assessed his breathing. Professional even in the aftermath of violence. "Possible concussion," she reported to Steven. "No apparent serious injuries." Steven nodded, then addressed Deek directly. "You're going to stay right there until we reach the station. You're going to keep your hands where I can see them, and you're going to think very carefully about the choices that brought you to this moment." Deek tried to sit up, his pride warring with his body's reluctance to move. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Steven interrupted, his voice carrying absolute finality. "It's been over since the moment you decided to hit my wife. Everything after that was just you learning a lesson you should have figured out years ago." The train began to slow, the rhythm of wheels on tracks changing as they approached Reno Station. Through the windows, they could see the lights of the city growing brighter, more defined. And there, on the platform, the unmistakable flicker of red and blue lights. Victor's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching Reno Station. Please remain in your seats until we've come to a complete stop and the authorities have boarded. Thank you for your patience." Elena retrieved the knife from under the seats, handling it carefully by the blade to preserve fingerprints. 23 years of marriage to Steven, but before that, 2 decades as a federal marshal. She knew evidence when she saw it. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, she said to no one in particular. Probably looking at 5 to 10, given his priors. Deek's face went white. In his rage and humiliation, he'd forgotten that Elena wasn't just Steven Seagal's wife, she was someone who understood the criminal justice system from the inside. The train shuddered to a stop with a mechanical sigh. Outside, they could hear voices, footsteps, the organized bustle of law enforcement preparing to board. Tasha ended her live stream with shaking hands. 28,000 viewers had watched the entire confrontation unfold in real time. Her phone was buzzing with notifications, friend requests, interview requests, news outlets wanting to verify what had just been broadcast to the world. But all she could think about was what Elena had said earlier. "You just made your last mistake." It hadn't been a threat. It had been a diagnosis. The doors hissed open, and the real world flooded back into Car 7. The knife had changed everything and nothing. Steven Seagal stood over Deek's sprawled form with the same calm presence he'd maintained throughout the confrontation, hands relaxed at his sides, breathing steady and controlled. The disarmament had taken perhaps 2 seconds, a fluid redirection that had turned Deek's aggression into his own defeat. But it was the aftermath that truly revealed the master's skill. "You could have hurt him badly," Elena observed, crouching beside Deek to monitor his condition. Her voice carried no judgment, just clinical interest in her husband's restraint. "Could have killed him," Steven replied matter-of-factly. "Didn't seem necessary." Deek groaned, trying to process what had happened through the fog of his concussion. The attack had felt perfect in his mind: surprise, violence, dominance. Instead, he'd found himself flying through the air like he weighed nothing, His weapon gone, his body aching from an impact he couldn't even remember clearly. My head, he mumbled, trying to sit up. Stay down, Elena instructed, pressing gently on his shoulder. Possible concussion. You'll want to be still when the paramedics arrive. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman he'd terrorized was now providing medical care, ensuring his well-being even after he'd tried to cut her face. Tasha's live stream had ended, but her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. 28,000 people had witnessed something unprecedented. Real violence met with surgical precision, aggression transformed into Aikido poetry. The video was already being shared, reposted, analyzed frame by martial arts enthusiasts and casual observers alike. Ma'am, the college student finally spoke up, his voice shaky with adrenaline. Are you okay? Do you need anything? Elena smiled at him, the first genuine warmth she'd shown all evening. I'm fine, thank you. What's your name? Marcus. Marcus Chun. Well, Marcus, you handled yourself well tonight. Staying calm, not interfering, that took wisdom. The praise meant more to Marcus than any grade he'd received in 4 years of college. Coming from someone who'd just faced down an armed attacker with inhuman composure, it felt like a benediction. Carter and Gwen Decker had remained in their seats throughout the confrontation, but now they approached with the careful respect of people who'd witnessed something sacred. 53 years married, Carter said to Steven, and I thought I knew what partnership looked like. You two just redefined it. Gwen nodded agreement. She was never in danger, was she? You were watching the whole time. Steven's expression softened slightly. Elena can handle herself better than most people realize. I just provide backup when the situation calls for it. Through the windows, they could see police officers boarding the train, their movements efficient and professional. Victor Penrose was briefing them, gesturing toward Car 7 while consulting his incident report. Federal marshals, Elena murmured, recognizing the bearing of the lead officer even at a distance. Someone called in the right jurisdiction. Detective Sandra Key entered the car first, her presence immediately commanding attention. Mid-40s, Asian American, with the kind of confidence that came from years of dealing with situations that had spiraled beyond normal police work. Mrs. Seagal, she said, approaching Elena directly. I'm Detective Key, Transit Division. We spoke on the phone about the Hoffman case last year. Elena rose from beside Deek, recognition dawning. Sandra, I didn't expect to see you here. When dispatch said Steven Seagal was involved in an incident, I figured there had to be more to the story. Key's eyes took in the scene, Deek groaning. On the floor, the knife bagged as evidence. The other passengers clearly shaken but unharmed. Looks like I was right. 2 paramedics entered behind the detective, immediately moving to assess Deek's condition. Their examination was thorough but gentle, professional courtesy extended even to someone who'd moments ago been wielding a weapon. Mild concussion, the lead paramedic reported. Vitals stable. He'll need observation overnight, but nothing serious. Could have been much worse, Detective Key observed, looking at Steven with professional curiosity. Reports say he came at you with a blade. Steven shrugged slightly. People make poor choices when they're scared. I try not to make their problems worse than they need to be. As the paramedics helped Deek onto a stretcher, his eyes found Elena's. For a moment, his expression was clear of the rage and bravado that had driven him all evening. You knew, he said quietly. From the beginning, you knew how this would end. Elena considered the question seriously. I knew you were in pain. I knew you were looking for someone to blame for that pain. And I knew that if you chose violence, my husband would stop you. She paused. What I didn't know was whether you'd be smart enough to choose differently. Deek closed his eyes as they wheeled him past. He'd gotten his answer about what kind of criminal he was, the predictable kind. Detective Key finished taking statements from the other passengers, each account consistent with what the security cameras had recorded. Marcus Chun, still shaky from witnessing real violence for the first time. Carter and Gwen Decker, full of praise for Elena's composure and Steven's restraint. Tasha Morales, whose live stream had already been downloaded and preserved as evidence. 28,000 viewers, he mused, reviewing Tasha's phone. This is going to be everywhere by morning. Elena sighed. We try to keep a low profile. Not much chance of that now, the detective replied with sympathy. But if it's any consolation, what they'll see is exactly what happened, someone who refused to be intimidated, and someone who used exactly the amount of force necessary to stop a threat. Steven moved to collect their belongings. The simple act of gathering Elena's purse and e-reader somehow managing to convey both protectiveness and partnership. 23 years of marriage had taught them to function as a unit, each anticipating the other's needs without discussion. "We'll need full statements," Detective Key said, "but it can wait until morning if you prefer. I imagine you'd like to get home." Elena looked at her husband, a silent communication passing between them. Home meant their ranch in Montana, isolation and peace after a night of unwanted publicity. But first, there would be questions, reports. The inevitable media attention once Tasha's video went viral. The price of being married to a legend was that even acts of self-defense became public spectacle. "Tomorrow's fine," Elena agreed. "We'll be at the Reno Hilton if you need us." As they prepared to leave the train, Victor Penrose approached them with obvious respect. "Ma'am, sir, I want you to know, in 23 years of conducting, I've never seen anything handled with more class. You could have hurt that man badly, but you chose restraint. That speaks to character." Steven nodded acknowledgement. Violence should always be the last option, not the first. They stepped off the train into the cool Nevada night, leaving behind a story that would be told and retold, analyzed and debated for months to come. But for Elena and Steven Seagal, it was just another evening when calm had proven stronger than chaos, when preparation had triumphed over desperation. The night was quiet now, peaceful in a way that only came after storms had passed. The Reno police station at 2:47 a.m. buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that followed high-profile incidents. Officers moved between desks with purpose while dispatchers fielded calls from news outlets that had somehow gotten wind of the story before the paperwork was even filed. Detective Sandra Key led Elena and Steven through the maze of activity, her expression apologetic but resigned. "I'm sorry about this. Word leaked faster than we expected." Through the station's front windows, they could see the first news van pulling into the parking lot, its satellite dish already extending toward the sky like a mechanical flower seeking light. "How many people saw the live stream?" Elena asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. "Last count was over 200,000, he replied. "And climbing. The video's been shared on every major platform." Steven's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of his frustration. 23 years of marriage had taught Elena to read his micro-expressions, and she could see him calculating the cost of their newfound notoriety. In interview room 3, they sat across from Detective Key while she reviewed the evening's events with professional thoroughness. Her questions were respectful but precise, building a complete picture of everything that had transpired from the moment. Deek boarded the train. "For the record," he said, consulting her notes, "you identified yourself as a trauma psychologist to the suspect?" "Former federal marshal, current trauma psychologist," Elena corrected. "I wanted him to understand that his intimidation tactics weren't working on someone trained to handle crisis situations." "And you, Mr. Seagal, you remained in your seat until the suspect produced the weapon?" Steven nodded. Elena was managing the situation effectively. "My intervention wasn't necessary until he escalated to lethal force." He made notes, her expression thoughtful. "In your professional opinion, Mrs. Seagal, was the suspect's behavior consistent with someone experiencing post-incarceration adjustment issues?" Elena considered the question carefully. "Classic presentation. Hypervigilance, need to establish dominance, difficulty reading social cues. Prison teaches survival mechanisms that don't translate well to civilian life. Doesn't excuse what he did," he observed. "No," Elena agreed. "But it explains it. Understanding motivation doesn't mean absolving responsibility." At renowned regional medical center, Dante Rowles lay in a hospital bed under police guard, his head wrapped in monitoring equipment. The concussion was mild, but protocol required overnight observation for anyone who'd suffered head trauma. Dr. Sarah Martinez finished her examination with professional efficiency, noting his vitals on the chart. "You're lucky," she told him, matter-of-factly. "Could have been much worse." Deek stared at the ceiling, replaying the evening's events in his mind. Every choice he'd made seemed obvious in retrospect. Textbook criminal psychology, just like Elena had said. He'd been played by someone who understood him better than he understood himself. The woman, he said quietly. Is she really a psychologist? Officer Jim Reeves looked up from his paperwork. Former federal marshal. Worked hostage negotiations for 15 years before switching to trauma psychology. You picked the wrong target, friend. Deek closed his eyes, the weight of his mistake settling in his chest like a stone. 3 years in prison, 6 months of parole, and he'd blown it all in one evening of wounded pride and poor impulse control. Back at the police station, Detective Key was wrapping up the formal interviews when her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the display and smiled. Dr. Sarah Chun, she announced. She runs the Women's Self-Defense Institute downtown. Wants to know if you'd be interested in speaking at their next summit. Elena looked surprised. Speaking about what? Psychological tactics for de-escalating confrontations. Apparently, word is already spreading about how you handled tonight's situation. Steven leaned back in his chair, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. 23 years of marriage, and she still surprises me with what she's capable of. The compliment brought a flush to Elena's cheeks, the first time all evening she'd shown any emotion beyond clinical calm. Key's phone buzzed again and again. Channel 8 wants an interview. So does Channel 4. And CNN just called the main desk. We don't do interviews, Steven said firmly. I understand, but you might want to prepare a statement. This story isn't going away quietly. Outside, 3 more news vans had joined the first, their reporters doing live broadcasts from the parking lot while they waited for any glimpse of the evening's protagonists. Tasha Morales sat in her bedroom, staring at her phone in disbelief. Her live stream had been viewed over 500,000 times. Her social media followers had jumped from 300 to 30,000 overnight. Interview requests were flooding her DMs. But more than the attention, she was processing what she'd witnessed. Not just the physical confrontation, though that had been incredible, but the psychological chess match that had preceded it. Elena Seagal had turned a terrorist into a case study, using his own aggression against him before her husband ever had to move. She opened her laptop and began typing. What I learned watching Steven Seagal's wife face down an armed attacker. A thread at 4:15 a.m. Detective Key finally released Elena and Steven through the station's rear exit, avoiding the media circus that had set up camp out front. But she had one final observation. Mrs. Seagal, in 20 years of law enforcement, I've seen a lot of victims. You were never a victim tonight, not for 1 second. That man thought he was hunting, but you turned him into the prey. Elena considered this as they walked toward their rental car. He was in pain, lashing out at a world that had hurt him. I just redirected that energy into a teachable moment, he added with admiration. Steven started the engine, eager to put the night behind them. But as they drove through Reno's empty streets toward their hotel, Elena was already thinking ahead. The summit, she said quietly. What about it? Maybe it's time to stop keeping such a low profile. Maybe there are other women who could benefit from understanding psychological tactics. Steven glanced at his wife, seeing the spark of purpose in her eyes that had first attracted him 23 years ago. The woman who'd faced down criminals and defused hostage situations was still there, just waiting for the right cause to draw her back into the light. Whatever you decide, he said simply, I'll support it. Behind them, Reno continued its restless existence, a city that had witnessed something remarkable and was still trying to understand what it had seen. By dawn, Tasha Morales had become an accidental journalist. Her Twitter thread about the train incident had been retweeted 40,000 times. Major news outlets were calling her the livestream witness, and her phone hadn't stopped ringing since 3 a.m. But more important than the attention was the conversation she'd started. Thread 4750 seconds. What struck me most wasn't the martial arts. It was how she never stopped being a person. Even when he slapped her, she didn't become a victim. She became more herself. At the Reno Hilton, Elena sat on the bed reading the coverage on her laptop while Steven ordered room service. Every major network had picked up the story, but they were all missing the point. Steven Seagal disarms train attacker, she read aloud. Action star saves passengers from armed threat. They're making it about you. Steven poured coffee from the room service cart, considering this. Good. Better that than having them dig into your background. But Elena was studying Tasha's thread, impressed by the teenager's insight. This girl gets it. She understood what was really happening. Her phone rang. Detective Key. Elena, I've got CNN, NBC, and 3 documentary crews asking for interviews. I can keep stalling, but this story has legs. What about the summit Dr. Chen mentioned? She's received over 300 RSVPs since last night. Women want to hear from you specifically, not about self-defense techniques, but about psychological tactics. How to use composure as a weapon. Elena found herself intrigued despite her preference for privacy. 23 years of marriage. To a celebrity had taught her to value anonymity, but perhaps it was time to step into her own spotlight. At renowned regional medical center, Dante Rowles was being discharged into police custody. The concussion had resolved, but the charges were mounting: aggravated assault, assault with a deadly weapon, violation of parole. His public defender had already explained that he was looking at 5 to 10 years. But something had changed in Deek during his night in the hospital. The rage that had driven him for so long felt exhausted, replaced by something uncomfortably close to shame. "The woman I attacked," he said to Officer Reeves as they prepared to transport him to county lockup. "She really was trying to help me, wasn't she?" Reeves considered the question. "Seems like she was trying to give you a way out. You just couldn't see it at the time." Dr. Sarah Chun had spent the morning fielding calls about her upcoming summit. The incident on the train had sparked national interest in psychological self-defense techniques, and Elena Seagal had become an unlikely symbol of what was possible when training met composure. "I don't want to exploit what happened," Chin told Detective Key during their phone conversation. "But if Mrs. Seagal is willing to share her expertise, it could help a lot of women." Marcus Chun, no relation to Dr. Chun, sat in his dorm room at UNR, processing what he'd witnessed. The livestream video showed him clearly, cowering behind his backpack, while Elena faced down an armed attacker with supernatural calm. He'd always considered himself reasonably brave, but seeing real courage in action had redefined his understanding of the word. Elena hadn't just stood her ground. She'd transformed the situation, turned a random act of violence into a masterclass in crisis management. His phone buzzed with yet another interview request. Everyone wanted to talk to the college student witness, but Marcus found himself reluctant to monetize the experience. What he'd seen felt too important to reduce to sound bites. Carter and Gwen Decker had returned to their small apartment in Sacramento, but their quiet retirement had been permanently altered by 3 hours on a train. Their neighbors couldn't get enough of their first-hand account of the Steven Seagal train incident. 53 years of marriage, Carter told their friend Ruth over coffee, and I thought I understood partnership. But watching those two work together, it was like they were one person with 4 hands. Gwen nodded, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. She never needed rescuing. She was the rescue. By noon, #TrainWife was trending on Twitter. Memes were spreading faster than news articles, but underneath the jokes was genuine admiration for Elena's composure. Women were sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation, discussing how Elena's example might apply to their situations. Elena read through the responses with growing amazement. She'd spent her career helping people process trauma, but she'd never considered that her own response to violence might be equally therapeutic for others to witness. "I think," she told Steven over lunch, "I need to make that call to Dr. Chun." The Women's Self-Defense Institute was a converted warehouse in downtown Reno, its main floor set up for the kind of summit that usually drew 50 people. Dr. Chun stared at the RSVP list with a mixture of excitement and panic. 1,200 confirmed attendees, she told her assistant. "We're going to need a bigger venue." But more than the numbers, Chen was excited about the conversation Elena could start. Physical self-defense was important, but psychological tactics were equally valuable and much harder to teach. At 2 p.m., Elena called Dr. Chen directly. "I'm not a public speaker," she began without preamble. "Neither was Rosa Parks," Chen replied. "Sometimes circumstances choose us instead of the other way around." Elena smiled despite herself. "When is the summit?" "Originally next weekend. But given the interest, I'm thinking we need to make this bigger. Maybe the convention center? Maybe broadcast it? Let me think about it." But even as Elena said the words, she knew she'd already decided. 23 years of keeping a low profile had served its purpose, but perhaps it was time to use her visibility for something constructive. Steven found her on the hotel balcony an hour later, staring out at the Sierra Nevada mountains in the distance. "You're going to do it," he said. It wasn't a question. "People are hurting," Elena said simply. "Women especially." "If sharing what?" I know can help even a few of them feel more confident, more prepared. Isn't that worth some temporary fame? Steven moved to stand beside her, his presence as calming as always. You know I'll support whatever you decide. But are you sure you're ready for this level of attention? Elena thought about Tasha's thread, about the thousands of women who'd reached out, about the chance to turn one night's violence into something constructive. I've spent my whole career helping people heal from trauma, she said. Maybe it's time to help them prevent it instead. The decision was made. In 1 week, Elena Seagal would step into the spotlight she'd spent decades avoiding, carrying with her the lessons of a night when silence had proven stronger than shouting, when preparation had triumphed over desperation. The ripples were still spreading, touching lives across the country. And at the center of it all was the quiet recognition that sometimes the most powerful response to violence wasn't violence in return, it was the refusal to be diminished by it. The summit would be just the beginning. 3 weeks after the train incident, the Reno Convention Center buzzed with an energy Elena Seagal had never experienced. 1,200 women filled the main auditorium, their conversations creating a symphony of anticipation that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Outside, overflow crowds watched on massive screens while news crews documented what had become the largest women's safety summit in Nevada history. Elena stood backstage, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. 23 years of marriage to Steven had taught her to navigate public attention, but this was different. This wasn't about celebrity, it was about substance. 5 minutes, Dr. Sarah Chun announced, her excitement barely contained. The live stream has 40,000 viewers already. Steven squeezed Elena's hand gently. Remember, you're not performing. You're just sharing what you know. She nodded, finding calm in his presence as she always had. But this time, the calm wasn't just for her own benefit. It was something she'd be teaching others to cultivate. The auditorium fell silent as Elena walked onto the stage, her movement deliberate and unhurried. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, professional but approachable, commanding but not intimidating. The woman who'd faced down an armed attacker with supernatural composure now faced something potentially more challenging: vulnerability before an audience. 3 weeks ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the space. I was just trying to get home from visiting my sister. I was reading a book, minding my own business, when someone decided I looked like an easy target. A ripple of recognition moved through the audience. Most had seen the viral video, but hearing Elena's perspective added layers the footage couldn't capture. What you saw on that live stream wasn't luck, and it wasn't just having a famous husband. It was the result of 30 years of training, first as a federal marshal, then as a trauma psychologist. I want to share some of what I've learned with you today. In the third row, Tasha Morales sat with her mother, still processing her role in making this moment possible. Her live stream had grown into something far beyond her teenage imagination, but seeing Elena speak about it with such dignity made her proud of her decision to keep filming. The first principle, Elena continued, is that your mind is your strongest weapon. Not because you can think your way out of every situation, but because preparation creates options. When someone tries to intimidate you, they're counting on chaos, on you being too frightened or confused to respond effectively. She moved across the stage with the same controlled grace she'd shown on the train, her presence filling the space without dominating it. Let me tell you what I saw in my attacker that night. I saw someone who'd been hurt, who was lashing out at a world that had damaged him. Understanding that didn't make him less dangerous. It made him predictable. Elena spent the next 40 minutes breaking down the psychology of aggression, teaching her audience to recognize the warning signs of escalating violence and the techniques for de-escalation. But more than tactics, she was sharing something deeper, the confidence that came from refusing to see yourself as a victim. Silence isn't submission, she said, her voice gaining strength. Sometimes silence is the most powerful response you can give. It forces the aggressor to fill the space, to reveal their intentions, to make choices that show you who they really are. In the audience, women took notes, recorded on their phones, whispered to friends. But more than information, they were absorbing Elena's presence, the living proof that composure could triumph over chaos. Carter and Gwen Decker watched from the VIP section, their faces glowing with admiration. At 81 and 79 respectively, They'd thought they were beyond learning new things about courage. Elena was proving them wrong. The most important thing I can tell you, Elena said as she approached her conclusion, is that you are not responsible for other people's violence, but you are responsible for your own response to it. You have more power than you think, more options than you realize, and more strength than anyone who would try to diminish you could possibly understand. The standing ovation began before she finished speaking, building into something that felt less like applause and more like gratitude made audible. Elena stood quietly, accepting the response with the same grace she'd shown everything else, waiting for the sound to subside before she spoke again. "I'll take questions now," she said simply. For the next hour, Elena fielded inquiries with the expertise of someone who'd spent decades thinking about violence and its prevention. Each answer revealed new facets of her knowledge, new applications of the principles she'd demonstrated on a train in the Nevada desert. As the summit concluded, Dr. Chun took the stage with tears in her eyes. "I've organized conferences for 15 years, she announced, "but I've never seen anything like this. Elena Seagal hasn't just taught us techniques. She's shown us what's possible when training meets character." Backstage afterward, Elena was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Sarah Martinez, Dr. Martinez from the hospital, where Deek had been treated. "I wanted you to know," Dr. Martinez said quietly, "that your attacker has been asking about psychological counseling. He said something about understanding why he made the choices he did. Your example is still teaching, even from a distance." Elena absorbed this information with interest. Accountability is the first step toward change. It took courage for him to ask for help. Steven materialized beside his wife as he always did when she needed grounding. "Ready to go home?" he asked gently. Elena looked out at the dispersing crowd, women energized and empowered by what they'd shared. "Almost," she said. "There's one more conversation I think we need to have." The Nevada Department of Corrections visitation room smelled of industrial disinfectant and broken dreams, its fluorescent lights casting everything in the harsh clarity of institutional pragmatism. Elena sat across from Dante Rowles, separated by reinforced glass and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Deek looked different, smaller somehow, though his physical dimensions hadn't changed. 3 weeks of incarceration had stripped away the swagger and bravado, leaving behind something raw and uncertain. His eyes, when they met Elena's, carried a burden she recognized from years of trauma counseling. "You came," he said, his voice barely audible through the communication system. "You asked," Elena replied simply. Steven sat beside his wife, silent but present, his calm attention focused on the man who'd tried to cut them both. There was no animosity in his bearing, no anger or judgment, just the watchful peace of someone who understood that healing sometimes required facing the source of harm. "I don't know why you're here," Deek continued, his hands clenched on the metal table. "After what I did, what I tried to do, most people would just forget I exist." Elena studied him with the same clinical interest she'd shown on the train, but now it was tempered with professional compassion. "You're in a counseling program now." "Yeah." Deek's laugh held no humor. "Turns out prison psychology classes aren't optional when you attack a federal marshal on camera." "Who knew?" "What are you learning?" The question caught him off guard. He'd expected accusation, demands for apology, maybe even gloating. Instead, Elena was asking about his education with genuine curiosity. "I'm learning that I don't know shit about myself," he said after a long pause. 3 years inside, I thought I had it figured out. Thought the world owed me something because I'd been dealt a bad hand. Thought strength meant making other people smaller." Elena nodded, making mental notes. The acknowledgement was a crucial step, recognition of distorted thinking patterns that had driven his behavior. "The counselor showed me the video," Deek continued. "Not just the fight part, the whole thing. Watching myself from outside, seeing how I acted." He shook his head. "I was pathetic. Predictable. You called every move I was going to make. Before I made it. Training," Elena said simply. "Pattern recognition. You weren't unique. You were displaying textbook responses to institutional trauma and social displacement. That's supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to help you understand that your behavior was learned, which means it can be unlearned." Steven spoke for the first time. "Everyone deserves a chance to become better than their worst moment." Deek's eyes moved to Steven, still incredulous that he was having this conversation with someone he'd tried to attack. On the train, when I had the knife, you could have destroyed me. I've seen your movies, I know what you're capable of. But you held back. Violence should teach, not just punish, Steven replied. You learned something from being stopped. You might not have learned anything from being destroyed. The visit continued for another 30 minutes, a careful dance between accountability and redemption. Elena asked probing questions about Deek's childhood, his time in foster care, the series of choices that had led him to that train. Not to excuse his behavior, but to understand the roots of rage that had nearly destroyed multiple lives. The thing that gets me, Deek said as their time ran out, is that you were trying to help me even when I was threatening you. Those questions you asked, the way you stayed calm, you were giving me chances to back down. Yes, Elena confirmed. Why? Elena considered the question carefully. Because everyone deserves the opportunity to choose differently. Even when they're making terrible decisions, even when they're hurting people, there's always a moment when change becomes possible. And if I hadn't taken those chances? If I'd kept escalating? Steven's expression grew serious. Then the lesson would have been taught differently. As they prepared to leave, Deek pressed his palm against the glass, a gesture that was part gratitude. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know, your example is still teaching me, even from in here. Elena placed her own hand against the glass, mirroring his gesture. Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve. It's about what serves healing. For all of us. Outside the correctional facility, Elena and Steven walked to their car in comfortable silence. The desert air was clean and sharp, carrying the promise of distance from institutional walls and institutional thinking. Think he'll make it? Steven asked as they drove toward the airport. Elena watched the Nevada landscape roll past, thinking about second chances and the courage required to take them. He's asking the right questions now. That's a start. Their flight back to Montana lifted off into a sky painted with sunset colors, carrying them home to the ranch where they'd built a life based on quiet strength and mutual respect. Below them, Reno faded into lights and memory, but the ripples of their encounter would continue spreading. 3 months later, Elena received a letter from the Department of Corrections. Dante Rowles had completed his counseling program with distinction and had begun mentoring other inmates struggling with anger management. The letter included a note from Deek himself, 3 sentences of careful handwriting that thanked her for seeing potential where others saw only threat. Elena filed the letter away, but not before showing it to Steven. They'd learned long ago that some victories were measured not in headlines, but in the quiet transformation of human hearts. The train incident had become legend, but the real story was simpler. Sometimes the most powerful response to violence was the refusal to let it have the final word. Peace, they discovered, wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the choice to build something better from its aftermath. The story was complete, but the lessons continued to spread, carried by everyone who'd witnessed the night when silence spoke louder than shouting, when preparation triumphed over desperation, and when the quiet strength of 2 people proved that dignity could not be stolen, only surrendered. And Elena Seagal had never surrendered anything. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.